Imagine yourself in a dim room, its pale wallpaper yellowing with age, the air still except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Outside, the world seems quiet, but beneath that quiet lies a humming, tension-like static behind every sound. It is the 1950s, or perhaps the 60s. It is a war of whispers, of dossiers passed beneath overcoats, of coded phone calls and glances exchanged in underground train stations. It is a war fought in embassies and alleyways, in filing cabinets and listening posts, in bedrooms and briefcases. And allow your mind to gently drift into the silent, forgotten corners of a conflict that was everywhere and nowhere. It is a war of trust, broken not with violence, but with a smile and a forged name. It is the Cold War, and though there are no bombs falling, no open battles raging, the world is quietly at war with itself. Let us ease into the strange, often dreary lives of those who lived double lives, not as glamorous spies, but as weary informants. We will meet a man who drank away his betrayal and crawl through the damp silence of Berlin's hidden tunnels. We will peer through the net curtains of American suburbia to find treason brewing beside the morning coffee. This is not a war of soldiers charging across fields, but tonight, let us walk slowly through this world of shadows. But for now, take a deep breath. Feel the pace of history slow. Let the tension fade into a low murmur. We begin, as many did, at the lowest rung of espionage, unseen, underpaid, and quietly unraveling. A slow descent into the muted world of everyday espionage. Imagine a gray morning. The streets are quiet but not silent. There's the dull hum of trolley wires overhead, the distant clatter of early footsteps on wet cobblestone, and the low rattle of a newspaper kiosk being unlocked. A quiet listener for a cause you may or may not truly understand. You do not wear a badge. You do not carry a gun. You were not trained in the art of spycraft. And yet, you live with secrets sewn into the lining of your days. In a city divided by fear and ideology, whether Berlin, Bucharest, or Belfast, you are just another worker heading to your job. You wear a plain coat, carry a plain briefcase, and walk at a plain pace, but you kept writing them, and always they had to be discreet. No one stops to look at you, and that is exactly how it should be, because you are not just a clerk or a mechanic or a secretary. You are an informant, a watcher. Most informants lived dull, repetitive, anxious lives. You would go to work, observe, record, report, and repeat. Your task might be to monitor which colleagues were absent too often, or who took long lunches, or who came back from international conferences with too much excitement in their eyes. You were told to notice who read foreign newspapers, who lingered too long by the payphones, who used strange expressions, or changed their hair too frequently. You didn't start out this way. No one really does. Some fall into it. You once mentioned a neighbor's suspicious radio habits to a colleague over lunch, and a week later, a man in a gray suit asked you to keep your eyes open. He didn't threaten, he didn't offer much, just a soft request and a sense that it would be wise to say yes. Others are drawn by ideology believers in capitalism, communism, or simple patriotism. Still more do it for money. A few extra banknotes a month in return for reports typed out on a borrowed typewriter or scribbled in small, neat cursive on notebook paper you hide behind the water heater. But the reality is far from dramatic, Forget the image of sleek agents in fast cars or glamorous double-crosses in moonlit cities. Sometimes your reports seemed pointless, even to you. The process of delivering your observations was wrapped in routines designed to blend in. Perhaps you left your notes inside the hollow casing of a bathroom light fixture in a train station. Perhaps you passed them during an innocent handoff at a flower stall. Or perhaps your handler stopped by your apartment once a month under the pretense of checking the gas meter, speaking only in clipped phrases as you handed over a packet wrapped in brown paper and twine. That even in your quietest moments, you are being watched by others, just like you are watching them. It was the slow drip of constant pressure, of playing a role for so long that you forgot how to be yourself. You were Magpie for Victor Elm, Lily Black, or something equally impersonal. You were not to speak these names aloud, not to write them. You practiced them silently on the bus, over and over, until they became a second skin that never quite fit. And what do you get for this? Not glory, not even trust, only the gnawing sense that your life is not your own, that every friendship might be a performance. Or, if they suspected, they never said, but more often it felt pointless. You were a pawn without a board, your moves directed by people you had never seen and would never meet. Was your own name being typed into someone else's report? Was your work being evaluated not by its accuracy, but by your demeanor, your posture, your tone of voice at lunch? The machine of espionage was faceless. You were one cog among thousands, grinding away in silence. Laughed at jokes you didn't find funny, gave vague answers to curious questions, and slowly your life began to divide in two: what you showed to the world and what you hid in plain sight. No medals or promotions, only uncertainty. Boredom was a weapon of the Cold War. It wasn't the sudden burst of violence that broke people. Your name was no longer just your name. Your family didn't know, and yet you became good at pretending. You smiled at the right moments. Sometimes the work felt important. You believed, or tried to believe, that you were protecting your country, that the information you gathered would prevent something terrible. There was no clear hierarchy and fear, because in this world, everyone was suspicious of everyone else. You began to wonder who was watching you. A low-level informant in East Germany once described the experience as living with a mouthful of water you cannot swallow or spit out. It was not the danger that haunted him, it was the endless holding still. In some cases, you were coerced, blackmailed for a minor crime, or threatened with consequences if you refused to cooperate. In Washington and New York, in suburbs with trimmed hedges and quiet libraries, housewives and civil servants filed anonymous tips about suspicious neighbors, about foreigners, about fellow parishioners who seemed off. In some cases, these were rooted in fear, in others, in prejudice. But always, the language was the same: vague concerns, coded suspicion, polite accusations. You never learned whether your work mattered, whether it helped or harmed. It just disappeared into the void of the bureaucracy. A night with a lover, a borrowed book, a careless joke told at a party. They started seeing danger everywhere. They became obsessive. They checked their phones twice before hanging up. They kept curtains closed even on bright spring mornings. They stopped trusting themselves. Any of these might be twisted into leverage. The choice was never really a choice. In others, you were simply ignored. You filed reports faithfully for years, only to find your handler had been reassigned, or worse, arrested, defected, vanished. The Americans had their own versions of you. For them, it was anti-communism. For others, anti-capitalism. But the effect was strangely identical. Ordinary people whispering about other ordinary people. Truth blurred with conjecture. Motives hidden under layers of protocol and paperwork. Some found themselves believing their own fictions. The loneliness was profound. You couldn't talk about your work, not really. You might hint at frustrations, but the truth remained buried. And over time, the burden of duality chipped away at you. It became harder to laugh without watching yourself do it. Harder to sleep without imagining footsteps on the stairs. In the Soviet Union, a factory worker in Leningrad once served as an informant for nearly a decade. His reports, later declassified, were meticulously written full of grammar, corrections, and emotional restraint. He reported on fellow welders, on the tone of radio broadcasts, on jokes whispered over lunch. In the end, it turned out most of his reports had been ignored, but he never stopped writing them. Why? Because they told me it was important, he wrote. And because it was the only thing that made me feel seen. There's a cruel irony in that. You live in secret just to feel visible. And then there were the mistakes, false reports, misidentifications, fabricated threats. A neighbor disappears because of something you said. A promotion is denied because of a half-truth. Someone is arrested. Someone flees. You don't know the full story. You're not told. You're just asked to continue reporting and reminded that loyalty is silent. And sometimes, though rarely, you are caught. Not by enemies, but by your own. The agency cuts you loose. You are disavowed, your name redacted from records. Or worse, you are used as bait. In the feeling, however faint, that they were part of something larger. A lonely one, yes, but purposeful, or leverage, or simply forgotten. You vanish quietly, just as you lived. And yet, for all this bleakness, many continued. Some even took pride in their role, in their secrecy. Because in a world constantly divided between East and West, between us and them, even the smallest act of espionage felt like a stand. Even if that purpose was buried beneath layers of lies and long days at a desk. And so you walk home again, coat buttoned to the collar, briefcase under your arm, the fog curling low around the street lamp. The city is quiet now, but in that quiet, you feel the weight of everything unsaid, unread, unrecorded. You reach your door, you turn the key, you step inside and lock it behind you. And tomorrow, you will do it all again. A long, slow unraveling behind smiles, brandy, and betrayal. Let us return to that quiet room. A worn leather armchair near a dusty window. The afternoon light falls through the curtains in soft ribbons, scattering across a low table where a crystal decanter sits half full of scotch. The scent in the air is familiar. Old books, pipe smoke, damp wool. A radio hums faintly in the background, but the voice is too quiet to understand. This is a place where words are often said softly, or not at all, where silence isn't empty, but dense with meaning. This is the kind of room where Kim Philby would have felt at home. Harold Adrian Russell Philby Kim, to almost everyone who knew him, was not a man of action. He was not a saboteur or an assassin. His weapons were charm, ambiguity, and time. And through them, he managed to deceive some of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. for nearly 3 decades. His father, St. John Philby, was an explorer, Arabist, an advisor to the rulers of the Arabian Peninsula, man of many opinions and few allegiances. The old aristocratic order was crumbling, and to many young minds, communism, for all its rigid doctrines and distant leaders, seemed like the only answer to a world teetering on the edge. Kim grew up with the scent of foreign earth and empire dust always clinging to his clothes. He attended Westminster School, then Trinity College, Cambridge, and it was there among idealistic debates and smoky student lounges that the seeds of his transformation were quietly planted. To begin understanding him, we must first understand his world. Born in 1912, Philby was raised amid British colonial privilege. But something inside him shifted, perhaps a quiet indignation at inequality, or perhaps just the allure of doing something secret, something larger than life. Cambridge, in the 1930s, was a furnace of ideology. The world outside seemed to be sliding into darkness. Fascism was rising across Europe. Philby wasn't loud about his beliefs. He didn't march with banners or shout from podiums. By 1934, Kim Philby was in Vienna, watching the rise of authoritarianism firsthand. There, he worked with leftist resistance groups, fell in love with a young Austrian woman named Litzi Friedman herself, a committed communist, and married her, partly for love, partly to protect her from the growing tide of anti-Semitic laws. Ambitious, his background gave him access, his education gave him polish, his politics gave him motive, and his manner calm, self-deprecating, deeply British, made him invisible in plain sight. Soft-spoken, and from the very beginning, he was useful. It was around this time, in those tense, shadowed streets, that Philby was recruited by Soviet intelligence. He was young. The Soviets saw potential not in his brawn or bravado, but in his pedigree. The mission was simple: rise through the ranks of British society, get close to power, report back quietly. Philby obeyed. He moved through rooms full of diplomats and officers with ease, laughing softly, making quiet jokes, sharing whiskey. His colleagues called him Kim with fondness. They liked him, respected him, some even loved him. By the late 1930s, he was back in Britain, carefully reshaping his image. He distanced himself from overt political affiliations. He positioned himself as a journalist, then a war correspondent. And when World War II broke out, he found his opportunity. They needed capable men who could be trusted. He had access to Allied plans, agent rosters, covert missions. He knew where operations were planned and when. He knew which Soviet spies the West suspected and which they didn't. And he quietly fed all of it to Moscow. Men who could speak the language of diplomacy and secrecy. Philby, ever modest, ever affable, slid smoothly into their ranks. British intelligence SIM I-6 was expanding. The irony did not escape him. There he was assigned to counter Soviet influence while passing British secrets directly to the USSR. And yet, he performed the job brilliantly. So brilliantly, in fact, that his star continued to rise. He began in Section 5, focusing on anti-communist operations. In a matter of years, Philby became head of SIS's anti-Soviet section. But how did he do it? Not by hacking files or intercepting radio waves. His methods were slower, more human. He'd memorize key details from a day's briefing, return home, and type them out late at night on his own typewriter. He'd hand these documents off to Soviet handlers in quiet meetings, sometimes in parks, sometimes on back streets, often under the guise of something ordinary. What set Philby apart was not what he knew, but how utterly trustworthy he seemed. He didn't hide in shadows. And so, for years, no one looked too closely. When his friends Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, fellow Soviet spies, suddenly defected to Moscow in 1951, suspicion finally crept toward Philby. After all, Burgess had stayed with Philby in Washington just before his disappearance. MI6 opened an inquiry. The Americans were furious. The British were cautious. Philby, cool as ever, denied everything. And for a time, they believed him. He stood before the press and said clearly, almost blandly, "I have never been a communist." Instead, he was quietly exiled to journalism, sent to Beirut, ostensibly as a Middle East correspondent, fell deeper into isolation. A defector from the Soviet bloc had identified Philby as a longtime agent. He disembarked in the USSR, and from that moment on, he never returned. British officials approached him again, this time more seriously. There were whispers of a confession, of a quiet deal. But before anything could be formalized, Philby vanished. His marriage crumbled. His health began to suffer. But even there, rumors followed. And Philby, despite the warm sun and distant gunfire of regional tensions, began to unravel. He was dismissed from MI6, but not charged. There wasn't enough evidence. He drank more. Then, in 1963, the walls finally closed in. MI6 had new information. He didn't disappear dramatically. There was no high-speed chase, no midnight standoff. He simply walked onto a ship bound for Odessa. His defection sent shockwaves through British intelligence. How could someone so trusted, so liked, so central, be working for the enemy all along? In Moscow, Philby was given a small apartment, a modest stipend, and a kind of uneasy welcome. The Soviets were grateful, but wary. After all, if he had deceived one empire, what was to stop him from deceiving another? He missed English newspapers, cricket, dry humor, real whiskey. He remarried again, but the sparkle was gone. He was no longer a secret asset, no longer a rising star. He was simply a defector, a puzzle, a man whose past was more interesting than his present. His life in the USSR was, by most accounts, dull. He missed London. He spent his last years translating spy manuals into Russian, lecturing young recruits, and drinking alone. Far from the illusion of purpose that once drove him, he died in 1988, buried with Soviet honors, but far from the land of his birth, far from the friends he betrayed, to Cambridge, to the club lounges of London, to none of them fully, to all of them fatally. And what do we make of him? Was Kim Philby a traitor, a patriot of another cause, a lost idealist? He was also a symbol of something deeper, the loneliness of divided loyalties, the slow decay of trust, the weight of living a lie so long that it begins to feel like truth, a self-serving manipulator. Perhaps he was all of these, but in the quiet world of Cold War espionage, he once said, "To betray, you must first belong." And Philby belonged to many places, to Britain, to the Soviet Union. So now, as the fire dies in that old drawing room, and the decanter stands empty on the table, let the room fall still again. The man who lived in whispers is gone, and in his place, only questions remain. The Cold War did not reward its spies with glory. It rewarded them with silence. And from that silence, we descend even deeper, beneath the streets, into the dirt and shadows, into the forgotten tunnels of Berlin. A buried war beneath cobblestone streets and the city that learned to listen with its walls. Picture yourself walking through a quiet Berlin neighborhood on a foggy morning, the kind of fog that makes your footsteps seem softer and your breath linger a little longer in the cold air. The streets are lined with tall apartment blocks, each one a little too uniform, a little too silent. And under that stage was an invisible, sprawling backstage made, not of dressing rooms and rigging, but of tunnels, wires, and ears pressed eternally to the wall. The buildings watch you with blank faces, rows of windows like closed eyes. The street signs are neat, the trees bare in the late autumn chill. But you know that beneath your feet, something else is hidden, something vast, something listening, carved into 4 allied sectors. The city had a strange kind of geometry. Its western half, an island of capitalism, surrounded by the vastness of East Germany's communist terrain. At public squares and private dinner tables, every conversation might be overheard. To smile without meaning it, to answer questions with safe vagueness. Children were taught what not to say long before they understood why. Every window might be watched, every building bugged. From 1945 onward, Berlin became the Cold War's most symbolic and strategic fault line. West Berlin was guarded, supplied, and protected like a precious object. East Berlin was tightly monitored, patrolled by the Stasi, the most pervasive state security agency in the Eastern Bloc, and every person who lived in this city, regardless of side, knew they were part of something more than themselves. In and grocery lines, on trams, and in lecture halls, people learned to live in this tension, to speak carefully. But what many did not know was that even the earth itself had ears. In 1954, the CIA and British SIS initiated Operation Gold, perhaps the most ambitious surveillance tunnel of the Cold War. The idea was both elegant and daring. Dig a tunnel from the American sector of West Berlin underneath the Soviet-controlled East, tap into Soviet telephone lines, and record military communications in secret. It was not the first such plan. During World War II, both the Allies and Axis powers had dabbled in underground wiretaps, but this tunnel would be different, longer, deeper, more advanced. The tunnel stretched 1,476 feet, nearly half a kilometer, lined with concrete slabs and reinforced with metal arches. Ventilation systems kept the air moving. Pumps kept water from seeping in. From there, audio was fed back to the American sector and recorded onto reels of magnetic tape. Engineers worked in silence, often at night, their presence masked by an above-ground facility disguised as a telephone repair station. Construction began in 1954. It took over a year to complete. The walls sweated in the springtime. In winter, your breath would linger before your eyes. Inside, it was always cold, always dim. The air smelled of dust, oil, and the faint metallic temps of electronics. The tap itself was a delicate operation. American technicians identified the correct cables-thick bundles, carrying the voices and signals of Soviet command and clamped insulated sensors around them. Thousands of hours of conversations, most of it routine. But hidden within the mundane were nuggets of significance, code names. But the KGB made a calculated decision. They did not immediately act. There was just one problem. From the moment the tunnel idea was conceived, the Soviets already knew Unbeknownst to the CIA and CIS, a mole sat among them. George Blake, a British double agent working for the KGB. His motivations were complex, a mixture of ideological shift and a deep sense of betrayal over the West's treatment of colonized nations. Whatever the reasons, he became one of Moscow's most valuable assets. Soviet media showed pictures of cables, coils, and dripping pipes. A propaganda victory was claimed, and one of his earliest disclosures, the tunnel. As soon as Operation Gold was in its planning stages, Blake told the Soviets everything: the location, the timing, the goal. Instead, they allowed the tunnel to proceed. For nearly a year, the Soviets let their enemy tap into dead-end communications, deliberate misdirections, and occasionally, just enough truth to make it believable. They even routed some military conversations through alternative paths, creating the illusion of transparency, while keeping their real movements secret. It was one of the Cold War's most elaborate games of shadowboxing, and in April 1956, the Soviets staged a discovery. They announced, with theatrical outrage, that workers in East Berlin had uncovered a western tunnel beneath their soil. The tunnel was sealed. The operation ended. But the real value was never in the data. It was in the psychological game, the bluff wrapped in truth, the silence that spoke volumes. On the eastern side of the wall, the Stasi wove a web of surveillance so dense, so meticulous, that even the KGB took notes. Their network of listening posts spanned apartment blocks, schools, state buildings, and even public toilets. Bugs were hidden inside lamps, telephone earpieces, light switches, electrical sockets, and below ground. These were not military bunkers in the traditional sense. They were vaults of recorded humanity. The Stasi operated vast archives and bunker networks, some of which housed entire communication monitoring centers. In these underground chambers, agents would sit for hours on end, headphones on, fingers hovering above typewriters, transcribing conversations in real time. Tape reels filled cabinets. Not just what was said, but what wasn't. They cataloged pauses, nervous laughter, moments of hesitation. Another, filled with tapes of university professors debating the philosophy of dialectical materialism. Even the tiniest deviation from approved ideology could end up on a desk below street level. Filing systems grew into miniature labyrinths of human suspicion. One room might hold nothing but surveillance on factory workers discussing rationing. The Stasi believed in the power of silence. Some days, a single phrase might suggest a movement of missiles, or nothing at all. And yet, even here, many who worked there described the atmosphere as one of restraint, not action. Like librarians of anxiety, carefully curating fears, organizing them onto invisible shelves. In East Berlin, there were buildings that were not buildings at all, structures constructed specifically to house listening equipment. On the outside, brick. On the inside, walls lined with copper, wire, and dials. Some had fake windows, others entrances that led only to locked doors. To walk past them was to pass an ear you didn't know was listening. Covered with enormous white radomes, giant golf ball-shaped structures, it became one of the West's most important signals intelligence outposts. On the other side, the Americans and British weren't idle. In West Berlin, towering above the Grunewald forest, sat a strange white structure that looked like something from science fiction. Teufelsberg, literally, Devil's Mountain. Built atop a hill of World War II rubble, Teufelsberg hosted a massive NSA listening station. Inside, Analysts spent their days scanning radio frequencies, phone calls, microwave transmissions, searching not for clarity, but for patterns. They listened for tone, for cadence, for repetitions that might indicate code. Most days were fruitless. The mountain became a fortress of invisible war. Today, much of this underground Berlin has vanished or become something else. The tunnel from Operation Gold was eventually excavated and partially preserved. A segment of it can be walked in replicas, its musty air carefully recreated for museum visitors. The Stasi archives, once threatened with destruction after the fall of the wall, were saved, sorted, and opened. Citizens today can request to read their own files, flipping through the whispers of their past, recorded without consent. Teufelsberg still stands, its radams weathered by time, now covered in graffiti, visited by curious hikers and amateur photographers. But the listening has stopped, or has it, by the knowledge that even your walls had ears. Berlin is no longer divided by walls of concrete and barbed wire, but it still bears the imprint of listening. It is a city shaped by silence, by what was said behind closed doors, by what wasn't said in public squares. To visit Berlin today is to feel the echoes of that silence. You might walk down a quiet street, unaware that beneath your feet, 50 years ago, a room once buzzed with hidden microphones. You might touch a wall that once held a false panel behind which a man sat, headphones on, waiting for your voice. And if you listen, really listen, you can almost hear it. Not the voices, but the listening, hidden behind hedges, sitting at kitchen tables, speaking carefully in American suburbs that were never quite what they seemed. The hum beneath the hum, the breath behind the breath. Now we turn our ears away from war and tunnels, and toward something softer, something stranger. Not diplomats or soldiers, but ordinary people with dangerous thoughts. The quiet war that bloomed beneath trimmed hedges, floral couches, and coffee steam. Imagine, for a moment, a neighborhood that feels just a little too perfect. Rows of matching houses, each with a porch light that flicks on at precisely dusk. Lawns clipped short, edged with manicured hedges. Driveways where sedans sit peacefully. Mailboxes that click softly each morning. A place where the only sounds are sprinklers, birds, and the dull thud of newspapers hitting concrete. Now imagine that one of those homes, perhaps the one with the baby blue shutters, or the pale brick bungalow with the swings, not what it seems. Inside, someone is watching, listening, waiting. The Cold War did not only unfold in Berlin's tunnels or Moscow's alleyways, it also unfolded in split-level homes and cul-de-sacs. It unfolded in basements converted into filing rooms. The curtains were closed, just enough to imply privacy, but not secrecy. Lawns were maintained, but never meticulously. Trash bins were placed at the curb with quiet precision every Thursday morning. In attics that hid communication equipment beneath piles of old Christmas decorations. In quiet suburban streets across Washington, Arlington, Langley, and beyond. And 3 neatly stacked manila folders marked in pencil with initials that Don T belonged to anyone here. This was the war of the CIA's safehouses, an invisible network of ordinary spaces turned into instruments of secrecy. Let's open the door and step inside. It is a place to pass through. Coffee mugs that bore the logos of forgotten bowling leagues or small-town diners. Family photos, not real ones, but carefully staged with rented children and stock photos, smiles, sat on the mantel. The clock on the wall is set 5 minutes fast, always. The fridge contains 3 identical bottles of milk and no food. A briefcase, unmarked, rests under the dining table. To the outside world, these homes were unremarkable. In fact, that was their greatest strength. The cars parked outside were often models several years out of date, not flashy, but not old enough to draw attention. Inside, the atmosphere was one of studied mundanity, a beige couch, a wood-paneled television set. But look a little closer, and the illusion begins to fray. In the kitchen, the phone has no ringings, tapped directly into a silent receiver. In the back bedroom, there are no clothes in the closet, only a second telephone, a shortwave radio. This is a CIA safehouse, and it is not a place to live. Safehouses served many functions. Some were used for dead drops, secret exchanges of documents, photographs, microfilm, or cash. Others were for debriefings, where agents newly returned from foreign missions would be interviewed over long, quiet nights by officers trained to detect the subtle tells of deception. Many were used for handling assets foreign nationals brought in quietly from overseas defectors, or embedded informants whose identities had to be protected even from other branches of the U.S. government. A man might arrive at 2 a.m. blindfolded, escorted by agents who spoke only in code. He would sit in the living room for hours, while the television played static in the background. He might be asked to recount, in painstaking detail, the layout of a Soviet weapons lab, or the floor plan of a Chinese consulate in Vienna. Then, before sunrise, he would be gone. And when the mailman came later that morning, the agent drinking coffee at the kitchen table would nod politely and wave as if nothing had happened. The irony of the Cold War was that its boldest moves often happened in the quietest places. While the world focused on nuclear standoffs and missile tests, the CIA played a far subtler game. They understood something their Soviet counterparts were slower to accept: that the domestic front mattered. They knew how to throw casual dinner parties, how to chat about the price of canned soup, how to laugh about local sports teams. That ideology could be shaped not just by broadcasts or leaflets, but by suggestion. They were something more subtle, anchors by presence, by people living double lives in the most ordinary settings. Logs were kept in codes, hidden within crossword puzzles, left conspicuously on the coffee table. The woman who offered rides to school when other parents were late. They baked pies, hosted barbecues, and once, in the middle of a birthday party, received a dead drop from a Soviet informant hidden inside a children's gift bag. It's one thing to hide secrets in bunkers. It's another to hide them behind lace curtains. Some safehouses were staffed semi-permanently by officers posing as couples. These domestic agents were trained in the art of presence. They weren't spies in the Hollywood sense, anchors of an illusion. Neighbors knew them by their first names: the couple who always had too much Tupperware, the man who volunteered at the library. Inside their home, however, intelligence flowed. Encrypted messages were received via shortwave. Visitors came and went through the back entrance. One former agent, in an oral history years later, recalled spending 2 years in a Connecticut suburb as Mr. and Mrs. Harris. They smiled, thanked the guest, and handed the gift to their niece, who was actually an agency courier in disguise. Then they served cake. But these operations were not without cost. Living a double life, even in safety, wears on the mind. the constant maintenance of identity, of never slipping, never admitting, never forgetting what not to say require, a level of control that few could sustain indefinitely. Some agents began to forget who they were pretending to be. The sense of community, if it was built on a lie. Others grew attached to the lives they'd constructed, the friendships, the rituals. It's hard to betray someone who sent you a ladder or brought you soup when you were sick. I knew which floorboard creaked, which kitchen drawer always stuck. And still, none of it was ever really mine. From counterintelligence meetings to preparations for coups, the safe house played a background role in front-page history. Harder still to vanish without explanation. Knowing you'll become just another whispered story in the neighborhood, a moving truck at dawn, a house suddenly for sale. You know, one retired field officer once said, "There were safe houses I lived in longer than my own homes." Her kitchen was wired with copper shielding, allowing for messages to be sent and received without outside detection. Her husband thought she was an amateur ham radio hobbyist. They practiced daily tone, body language, pauses. They worked in the garage, where sound couldn't easily travel. Even the silence became a kind of noise. Some of the most sensitive Cold War operations took place in these sleepy homes. In one suburban home near Falls Church, Virginia, an agent spent 6 weeks preparing a Soviet defector for testimony before a Senate committee. At night, the defector slept on a cot in the basement, while lawn sprinklers ticked gently in the yard. The money was hidden in empty paint cans in the garage. His children played in the driveway, unaware of the espionage happening just feet away. In another house, on the edge of Langley, a female CIA officer posing as a housewife on one of the agency's most successful communications dead zones. He never asked questions. Eventually, the marriage ended, but she stayed in the house. And in one especially infamous case, an American double agent, now known as a traitor, used his family home as a hiding place for cash delivered by the KGB. The house was later sold, its secrets painted over in neutral beige. The physical design of many safe houses reflected their dual purpose. Basements were often reinforced. Some opened into crawl spaces. Others concealed safes that could only be unlocked by a sequence of subtle pressure points. Ventilation ducts were widened not to circulate air, but to move signals. Bathroom mirrors sometimes doubled as two-way glass. Not for interrogation, but for security agents needed to know if they were being watched during debriefs. In more elaborate homes, entire hidden rooms existed, narrow chambers behind bookshelves or inside walls, just large enough for a person to wait quietly during a raid or 4 hours during a deadlock. Few of these features were visible. Fewer still remain. As the Cold War drew to a close, the need for domestic safe houses began to wane. Technology changed. Surveillance went digital. Meetings happened via secure lines, not living rooms. Some houses were sold, others were repurposed. A few were quietly demolished, buried, like the secrets they once held. Another in Denver, a bungalow in San Diego. Their uses long ended, but the architecture remains. The wallpaper unchanged. The closet still echoing slightly when you close the door. But even now, some still exist. A house in Reston, Virginia, and maybe, somewhere, a neighbor still remembers the couple who lived there once. Nice people, a little private, moved away suddenly. They always seemed to have a lot of guests. It's early morning. As we draw the curtains on this segment, picture yourself sitting in one of these homes, but inside, You sit at the kitchen table, flipping through a newspaper you're not really reading. You're waiting, listening. A knock at the door. You glance once at the clock on the wall. It's 2 minutes fast, just the way you like it. Then you rise, quietly, carefully, and the morning resumes its gentle rhythm. A final exhale from a world stitched together by secrets and silence. And now we rise gently from the neighborhoods of silent watchers, from the tunnels deep beneath Berlin, from the drawing rooms where charm covered betrayal, and from the offices where ordinary people wore extraordinary masks. We return to the present, not suddenly, but softly, slowly. Let the imagery fade, like fog rolling back from a quiet valley at dawn. A war that was fought not just on battlefields or in the halls of power, but in basements, back rooms, alleys, and kitchens. The Cold War is over, but its echoes still drift in the margins of our lives, in dusty records, in unmarked buildings, in stories passed down without names. It was a war made of waiting. Waiting for phone calls that never came. Waiting on benches beside strangers who might never arrive. Waiting for the sound of a key turning in a lock too late or right on time. It was a war of silence, in suitcases, in eyes across smoke-filled rooms, in the final click of a tape recorder stopping, silence in cables. People who believed, who lied, who feared, who endured. People who made decisions in the dark and sometimes never saw the light again. And above all, it was a war of people, not heroes, not villains, but people. Some were driven by loyalty, others by desperation, many by nothing more than inertia, the slow drift into a life too tangled to escape. A young clerk in Prague who copied notes after hours. It was about Trusteed's construction, its collapse, its strange, slow rebuilding. A Soviet analyst who listened to Western broadcasts in secret ears, pressed to the radio in the dark. A woman in East Berlin who pretended not to notice that her ceiling clicked softly every night. As one might remember a long, strange dream. No need to check the locks. Vivid in moments, blurred in others. Full of things left unsaid. They are all gone now, but for a time they held the world in balance, not with might, but with restraint. The Cold War was strange in this way. It did not end with a scream, but with a sigh. Not with a blast, but with a slow, quiet thaw. And when it ended, there were no parades for those who waited in silence. No medals for the ones who never pulled a trigger. But still, they mattered. Because in the end, the Cold War was not just about weapons or nations. And now, that chapter of history lies behind us. But it is worth remembering, not with urgency, but with tenderness. Let the codes and code names grow quieter. There is no need for passwords here. The world outside has grown still, and the shadows no longer move with suspicion, but with calm. The clocks tick softly, the radio is silent, the tunnel is sealed, and the watchers have gone to sleep. Good night.